Edwin McMasters Stanton was an American lawyer and politician who served as Secretary of War under the Lincoln administration during most of the American Civil War. Stanton's management helped organize the massive military resources of the North and guide the Union to victory. He also organized the manhunt for Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth. However, he was criticized by many Union generals for perceived over-cautiousness and micromanagement. After Lincoln's assassination, Stanton remained as the Secretary of War under the new President Andrew Johnson during the first years of Reconstruction. He opposed the lenient policies of Johnson towards the former Confederate states. Johnson's attempt to dismiss Stanton ultimately led to President Johnson being impeached by the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. Stanton returned to law after retiring as Secretary of War, and in 1869 was nominated as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court by Johnson's successor, Ulysses S. Grant. However, he died 4 days after his nomination was confirmed by the Senate. Family and early life. Ancestry. Before the American Revolution, Stanton's paternal ancestors, the Stantons and the Maces, both of whom were Quakers, moved from Massachusetts to North Carolina. In 1774, Stanton's grandfather, Benjamin Stanton, married Abigail Macy. Benjamin died in 1800. That year, Benjamin's widow moved to the Northwest Territory, accompanied by much of her family. Soon, Ohio was admitted to the Union, and Macy proved to be one of the early developers of the new state. She bought a tract of land at Mount Pleasant, Ohio from the government and settled there. One of her sons, David, became a physician in Steubenville, and married Lucy Norman, the daughter of a Virginia planter. The marriage was met with the ire of Ohio's Quaker community, as Lucy was a Methodist and not a Quaker. This forced David Stanton to abandon the Quaker sect. Early life and education. The first of David and Lucy Stanton's 4 children, Edwin McMasters, was born to them on December 19, 1814 in Steubenville, Ohio. The Stantons later had 2 daughters, Oella and Pamphylia, and another son, Darwin. In his youth, Edwin was physically delicate, grave and studious, as well as frank, eloquent and empathetic, according to his classmates. Edwin's early formal education consisted of a private school and a seminary behind the Stantons' residence, called Old Academy. When he was 10, he was transferred to a school taught by a Presbyterian minister, where he studied Latin, Greek, history and other higher branches. It was also at 10 that Edwin experienced his first asthma attack, a malady that would haunt him for life, making him convulse at times. His asthma assured him that he would be unable to partake in highly physical activities, so he found interest in other things. Edwin was a voracious reader of books and poetry. He even formed a circulating library of sorts among him and his friends. Edwin attended Methodist church services and Sunday school regularly. At the age of 13, Stanton became a full member of the Methodist Church. David Stanton's medical practice afforded him and his family a decent but not affluent existence. When David Stanton suddenly died in December 1827 at his residence, Edwin and family were left destitute. Edwin's mother opened a store in the front room of the residence, selling the medical supplies her husband left her, along with books, stationery and groceries. The youthful Edwin was removed from school and employed at the store of a local bookseller, James Turnbull. Stanton began his tertiary studies at the Episcopal-affiliated Kenyon College in 1831. At Kenyon, Stanton worked earnestly at his studies. He was prominently involved in the college's Philomathesian Literary Society. Stanton sat on several of the society's committees, and often partook in its exercises and debates. Stanton was forced to leave Kenyon just as his second year began. His time at the school was short but fruitful. He had completed his courses in history, mathematics, chemistry, political economy, geology and Latin. His democratic political views were rooted in his agreement with then-President Andrew Jackson regarding the nullification crisis, a hotly debated issue among the Philomathesians. Further, Stanton's Episcopalian faith and his repulsion of the practice of slavery were solidified there. After Kenyon, Stanton was again employed by Turnbull. This time, he was sent to Columbus, Ohio to run a bookstore there. Stanton had hoped to obtain enough money to complete his final year at Kenyon. However, a small salary dashed the notion. He soon left Turnbull's employ permanently and returned to Steubenville to pursue studies in law. First marriage and early career. Stanton studied law aggressively in preparation for the bar. He was admitted to practice in 1835. January 1836 saw Stanton began work at a prominent law firm in Cadiz, Ohio under Chauncey Dewey, a well-known attorney. The firm's work with trials often fell to him. Stanton worked earnestly under Dewey, even at the expense of his health, earning much praise from fellow lawyers. Stanton's personal life also experienced growth. At the age of 18, Stanton met Mary Ann Lamson at Trinity Episcopal Church in Columbus, and they soon engaged. After buying a home in Cadiz, Stanton went to Columbus where his betrothed was. Stanton and Lamson had wished to be married at Trinity Episcopal, but Stanton's illness rendered this idea moot. Instead, the ceremony was performed at the home of Trinity Episcopal's rector on December 31, 1836. Afterwards, Stanton went to Virginia where his mother and sisters were, and escorted the women back to Cadiz, where they would live with him and his wife. Stanton's professional star continued to rise after his marriage. He partnered with the wealthy and influential lawyer Benjamin Tappan, while maintaining his connection with Dewey. In Cadiz, Stanton was situated prominently in the local community. He worked with the town's anti-slavery society, and with a local newspaper, the Sentinel, writing and editing articles there. In 1837, Stanton was elected the prosecutor of Harrison County, on the Democratic ticket. Further, Stanton's increasing fortune allowed him to purchase a large tract of land in Washington County, and several tracts in Cadiz. Rising attorney, returned to Steubenville. Stanton's relationship with Benjamin Tappan expanded when Tappan was elected the United States Senator from Ohio in 1838. Tappan asked Stanton to oversee his law operations, which were based in Steubenville. When his time as county prosecutor was finished, Stanton moved back to the town with his wife. Stanton's work in politics also expanded. He served as a delegate at the Democrats' 1840 National Convention in Baltimore, and was featured prominently in Martin Van Buren's campaign in the 1840 presidential election, which Van Buren lost. In Steubenville, the Stantons welcomed two children, a daughter in March 1840, whom they named Lucy Lamson, and a son they called Edwin Lamson in August 1842. Within months of Lucy's birth, she was stricken with an unknown illness. Stanton put aside his work and spent the summer at baby Lucy's bedside. She died in late 1841. Edwin, however, was healthy and active. The boy's birth refreshed the spirits in the Stanton household after baby Lucy's death. However, grief would return once again to the Stanton household in 1844. Mary Stanton was left bedridden by bilious fever. Her condition continued to worsen until she died in March. Stanton's sorrow verged on insanity, say historians Benjamin P. Thomas and Harold M. Hyman. He had Mary's burial attire redone repeatedly, as he demanded she look just as she had when they were wed 7 years prior. In the evenings, Stanton would emerge from his room with his eyes filled with tears and search the house frantically with a lamp, all the while asking, "Where is Mary?" Stanton regrouped and began to focus on his cases by the summer. One such case was defending Caleb J. McNulty, whom Stanton had previously labeled a glorious fellow. McNulty, a Democrat, was dismissed from his clerkship of the United States House of Representatives by unanimous vote and charged with embezzlement when thousands of the House's money went missing. Democrats, fearing the party's disrepute, made clamorous cries for McNulty to be punished, and his conviction was viewed as a foregone conclusion. Stanton, at Tappan's request, came on as McNulty's defense. Stanton brought a motion to dismiss McNulty's indictment. He employed the use of numerous technicalities and, to the shock and applause of the courtroom, the motion was granted with all charges against McNulty dropped. As every detail of the affair was covered by newspapers around the country, Stanton's name was featured prominently nationwide. After the McNulty scandal, Stanton and Tappan parted ways professionally. Stanton formed a partnership with one of his former students, George Wythe McCook of the Fighting McCooks. At the beginning of the Mexican-American War, men across the country hastened to enlist in the United States Army, with McCook among them. Stanton might have enlisted as well, if not for his doctor's fears about his asthma. Instead, he focused on law. Stanton's practice was no longer only in Ohio, having expanded to Virginia and Pennsylvania. He concluded that Steubenville would no longer prove adequate as a headquarters, and thought Pittsburgh most appropriate for his new base. He was admitted to the bar by late 1847. Attorney in Pittsburgh. Stanton formed a partnership with a prominent retired judge, Charles Shaler, while maintaining his collaboration with McCook, who had remained in Steubenville after returning from service in the Mexican-American War. While based in Pittsburgh, Stanton argued several high-profile suits. One such proceeding was State of Pennsylvania v. Wheeling and Belmont Bridge Company and others in the United States Supreme Court. The case concerned the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, the largest suspension bridge in the world at the time, and an important connector for the national road. The bridge's center rose some 90 feet but proved to be a nuisance to passing ships with tall smokestacks. With ships unable to clear the bridge, enormous amounts of traffic, trade and commerce would be redirected to Wheeling, West Virginia. On August 16, 1849, he urged the Supreme Court to injunct Wheeling and Belmont, as the bridge was obstructing traffic into Pennsylvania, and hindering trade and commerce. Associate Justice R.C. Grier directed those who were aggrieved by the bridge's operations to go to a lower court, but left an avenue open for Stanton to file the injunction in the Supreme Court, which he did. Oral arguments for the Pennsylvania v. Wheeling and Belmont began on February 25, 1850, which was also when Stanton was admitted to practice in the Supreme Court. Wheeling and Belmont argued that the court lacked jurisdiction over the matters concerning the case. The justices disagreed. The case proceeded, allowing Stanton to exhibit a dramatic stunt, which was widely reported on and demonstrated how the bridge was a hindrance. He had the steamer Hibernia ram its 85-foot smokestack into the bridge, which destroyed it on a piece of the ship itself. May 1850 saw the case handed over to Reuben H. Walworth, the former Chancellor of New York, who returned a vivid opinion in February 1851 stating that the Wheeling Bridge was an unwarranted and unlawful obstruction to navigation, and that it must be either removed or raised so as to permit the free and usual passage of boats. The Supreme Court concurred. In May 1852, the court ordered in a 7 7-2 ruling that the bridge's height be increased to 111 feet. Wheeling and Belmont were unsatisfied with the ruling and asked Congress to act. To Stanton's horror, a bill declaring the Wheeling Bridge permissible became law on August 31, effectively overriding the Supreme Court's ruling and authority. Stanton was disgruntled that the purpose of the court, to peacefully decide and remedy disputes between states, had been diminished by Congress. McCormick v. Manny and second marriage. A by-effect of Stanton's performance in Pennsylvania v. Wheeling and Belmont was that he was sought after for other prominent cases, perhaps most notably as the case of inventor Cyrus McCormick. In 1831, a young McCormick created a machine to harvest crops. The device was particularly useful in the burgeoning wheat fields of the western United States. Demand for McCormick's invention grew rapidly, attracting fierce competition, especially from fellow inventor and businessman John Henry Manny. In 1854, McCormick and his two prominent lawyers, Brevity Johnson and Edward M. Dickinson, filed suit against Manny claiming he had infringed on McCormick's patents. McCormick demanded an injunction on Manny's reaper. Manny was also defended by two esteemed lawyers, George Harding and Peter H. Watson. McCormick v. Manny was initially to be tried in Chicago, and the two lawyers wanted another attorney local to the city to join the team. The recommended choice was Abraham Lincoln. When Watson met Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, he had a dim first impression of him, but after speaking with Lincoln, Watson saw that he might be a good choice. However, when the venue of the proceedings was transferred to Cincinnati rather than Chicago, and the necessity for Lincoln was negated, Harding and Watson went for the first choice, Edwin Stanton. Lincoln was not made aware that he had been replaced, and still appeared at the proceedings in Cincinnati with his arguments prepared. Stanton's apprehension towards Lincoln was immediate and severe, and he did well to indicate to Lincoln that he wanted him to absent himself from the case. The case proceeded with Harding, Watson and Stanton and Manny's true defenders. Lincoln did not actively participate in the planning or arguing of the case, but kept in Cincinnati as a spectator. Stanton's role in Manny's legal trio was as a researcher, though he admitted that George Harding, an established patent lawyer, was more adept at the scientific aspects of the case. Stanton worked to summarize the relevant jurisprudence and case law. To win McCormick v. Manny for Manny, Stanton, Harding and Watson had to impress upon the court that McCormick had no claim to exclusivity in his reaper's use of a divider, a mechanism on the outer end of the cutter bar which separated the grain. A harvesting machine would not have worked properly without a divider, and Manny's defense knew this. However, to assure a win, Watson opted to use duplicity. He employed a model maker named William P. Woods to retrieve an older version of McCormick's reaper and alter it to be presented in court. Woods found a reaper in Virginia which was built in 1844, 1 year prior to McCormick's patent being granted. He had a blacksmith straighten the curved divider, knowing that the curved divider in Manny's reaper would not conflict with a straight one in McCormick's reaper. After using a salt and vinegar solution to add rust to where the blacksmith had worked to ensure the antiquity of the machine was undeniable, Woods sent the reaper to Cincinnati. Stanton was joyed when he examined the altered reaper and knew the case was theirs. Arguments for the case began on September 1855. In March 1856, Justices John McLean and Thomas Drummond delivered a ruling in favor of John Manny. McCormick appealed the decision to the Supreme Court, and McCormick v. Manny was, all of a sudden, a political issue, and the matters concerning the case found the way to the floor of Congress. While the Supreme Court and Congress brooded on the case, Stanton attended to some personal matters. In February 1856, Stanton became engaged to Ellen Hutchinson, a girl 16 years Stanton's junior. Stanton and Hutchinson met at a Pittsburgh church. She came from a prominent family in the city. Her father was Lewis Hutchinson, a wealthy merchant and warehouseman and a descendant of Meriwether Lewis. Despite the Hutchinsons' mother's apprehensiveness that her 26-year-old daughter was getting married to the 41-year-old Stanton, the two were married on June 25, 1856 at Hutchinson's father's home. They honeymooned at Niagara Falls, Montreal, the White Mountains and Nahant, Massachusetts. In his relationship to Hutchinson, Stanton reclaimed what he thought he had forever lost after the death of Mary, love of the abiding sort. Stanton and Hutchinson moved to Washington after the marriage. Part of this decision was rooted in Stanton's belief that he would see important work with the Supreme Court. They leased a home on C Street in Washington. Emergence in Washington in Pennsylvania. Stanton had become intimately acquainted with Jeremiah S. Black, the chief judge in the state's Supreme Court. This friendship proved profitable for Stanton when in March 1857, the recently inaugurated 15th President, James Buchanan, made Black his Attorney General. Black's succession to his new post was soon met with a land claims issue in California. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War and gave California to the United States, the United States agreed to recognize valid land grants by Mexican authorities. This was followed by the California Land Claims Act of 1851, which established a board to review claims to California lands. One such claim was made by José Y. Lementeur, a French-born merchant who asserted ownership of an assemblage of lands that included important sections of the state, such as a sizable part of San Francisco. When his claims were recognized by the land commissioners, the U.S. government appealed. Meanwhile, Black corresponded with a person named Auguste Juan, who stated that Lementeur's claims were invalid, and that he, under Lementeur's employ, forged the date listed on one of the approved grants. Black needed an individual loyal to the Democratic Party and to the Buchanan administration, who could faithfully represent the administration's interests in California. He chose Stanton. Ellen Stanton loathed the idea. In California, Edwin would be thousands of miles away from her for what was sure to be months, leaving her lonely in Washington, where she had few friends. Moreover, on May 9, 1857, Ellen had a daughter whom the Stantons named Eleanor Adams. After the girl's delivery, Ellen fell ill, which frightened Edwin and delayed his decision to go to California. In October 1857, Stanton finally agreed to represent the Buchanan administration's interests in California. Having agreed to a compensation of $25,000, Stanton set sail from New York on February 19, 1858 aboard the Star of the West, along with his son Eddie James Buchanan, Jr., the president's nephew, and Lieutenant H. N. Harrison, who was assigned to Stanton's detail by the Navy. After a tempestuous voyage, the company docked in Kingston, Jamaica, where slavery was disallowed. On the island, the climate pleased Stanton greatly, and at a church there, Stanton was surprised to see blacks and whites sitting together. Afterwards, Stanton and his entourage landed in Panama, and left there on a ship 3 times larger than the one on which they came, the Sonora. On March 19, the company finally docked in San Francisco, and bunkered at the International Hotel. Stanton took to his work with haste. In aid of his case, Stanton, along with his entire party and 2 clerks, went about arranging disordered records from California's time under Mexico. The Gemino Index that he uncovered gave information on land grants up to 1844, and with the assistance of a congressional act, Stanton unearthed records from all over the state pertaining to Mexican grants. Stanton and company worked for months sorting the land archives. Meanwhile, Stanton's arrival in California produced gossip and scorn from the locals, especially from those whose land claims would be in jeopardy should Stanton's work prove victorious. Further, President Buchanan and Senator Douglas were wrestling for control of California, and Stanton was caught in the crosshairs, resulting in a defamatory campaign against Stanton by Douglas' supporters. The campaign disheartened Stanton, but barely distracted him. Lamonture had built up a speciously substantial case. He had accrued a preponderance of ostensibly sound evidence, such as witness testimony, grants signed by Manuel Michel Torrena, the Mexican governor of California prior to cessation, and paper with a special Mexican government stamp. However, Auguste Juan's information was instrumental in Stanton's case. According to Juan, Lamonture had received dozens of blank documents signed by Governor Michel Torrena, which Lamonture could fill in as he will. Further, Juan had bored a hole in one of the papers to erase something, a hole that was still present in the document. Stanton also acquired letters that explicitly laid out the fraud, and stamps used by customs officials, one authentic and the other fraudulent. The fraudulent one had been used 11 times, all on Lamonture's documents. When Stanton sent to Minister of the Exterior in Mexico City, they could not locate records corroborating Lamonture's grants. In late 1858, Lamonture's claims were denied by the Land Commission, and he was arrested on perjury charges. He posted a $35,000 bail and left the country. As 1858 drew to a close, and Stanton prepared to return home, Eddie became sick. Whenever Stanton made arrangements to leave California, his son's condition grew worse. Edwin had written Ellen as often as he could as her anxiety and loneliness increased in Washington. She criticized him for leaving her in the town alone with young Ellie. January 3, 1859 saw Stanton and company leave San Francisco. He was home in early February. In the nation's capital, Stanton advised President Buchanan on patronage, and helped Attorney General Black extensively, even being mistaken as an assistant attorney general. Nonetheless, Stanton's affairs in Washington paled in comparison to the excitement he had experienced on the other side of the country, at least until he found himself defending a man who had become fodder for sensationalists and gossipers around the country. Daniel Sickles trial. Daniel Sickles was a member of the United States House of Representatives from New York. He was married to Teresa Baggioli Sickles, the daughter of composer Antonio Baggioli. Sickles' wife had begun an affair with Philip Barton Key, the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia and the son of Francis Scott Key, writer of the Star-Spangled Banner. On Sunday, February 27, 1859, Sickles confronted Key in Lafayette Square, declaring, "Key, you scoundrel, you have dishonored my home, you must die," then shot Key to death. Sickles then went to the home of Attorney General Black and admitted his crime. The subsequent Thursday he was charged with murder by a grand jury. The Sickles affair gained nationwide media attention for both its scandalous nature and its proximity to the White House. Soon, the press speculated that Daniel Sickles' political esteem was on the account of an affair between his wife and President Buchanan. Prominent criminal lawyer James T. Brady and his partner, John Gregg, came to Sickles' defense and solicited invited Stanton to join the team. Arguments for the trial began on April 4. The prosecution wanted to advance the theory that Sickles had also committed adultery and did not pay very much mind to his wife for her activities. When the judge disallowed this, the prosecution opted instead to highlight the heinous nature of Sickles' murder, and not address his reasons for doing the crime. Sickles' defense countered that Sickles had suffered from a temporary bout of insanity, the first such instance of an insanity plea in American jurisprudence. The events in the courtroom during the trial were nothing if not dramatic. When Stanton delivered closing arguments, stating that marriage is sacred and that a man should have the right to defend his marriage against those who chose to defile the purity of the sacrament, the courtroom erupted in cheers. A law student described Stanton's argument during the trial a typical piece of Victorian rhetoric, an ingenious thesaurus of aphorisms on the sanctity of the family. The jury in the case deliberated for just over an hour before declaring Sickles not guilty. The judge ordered that Sickles be released from his arrest. Outside the courthouse, Sickles, Stanton and company met a throng of individuals in adulation of the victory.